Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Information Studies 650 lecture, Community Archives. So here are weekly topics for this week. What are community archives? Why do community archives exist? What are some essential aspects of community archives? And how do some community archives challenge traditional archival practices? And as you can see here, we'll be looking at 4 of our course learning objectives during this lecture. So not necessarily focusing so much on uh, ethical obligations and social responsibilities of archivists, but definitely focusing on core concepts, i.e. what are community archives, the role that records creators play in the construction of social memory, ideally, as we'll discuss in community archives, quite a big role. We'll talk about some of the ways in which community archives connect to other aspects of archival administration, so connecting it to some of the subjects that we've talked about. And we will talk about one of the factors that have influenced the archival profession, namely changing ideas about what archives should document, and talk about how, in a lot of ways, community archives have served as a challenge to the ways that archives have done things and what archives have documented. And I think seeing the way that community archives operate has definitely made archives, more traditional archives, kind of think about what they do and why they carry out some of the things that they do in the way that they do. And included in that are things like people represented in archives and how that representation takes place. Okay, so we'll start by talking about what are community archives. So we have some quotes here from our readings this week. Flynn and their co-authors in the casual book chapter for this week mentioned some things. So collectors of materials, community members exercise some level of control. And again, this will vary from community archive to community archive, which we'll talk about later. But the main thing is active participation of a community in documenting and making accessible their history of their particular group and or locality on their own terms. So participation is a big thing. It's something that we've talked about in this course for the last few weeks. And it is a concept that is very central to the concept of community archives. And as we'll discuss later, one of the main things that differentiates community archives from their more traditional archival brethren. Okay, community archives can be based around ethnic, racial, and religious identity, gender, sexual identity, economic class, and geographic location. Although the Caswell article notes that identities of communities are essentially artificial constructs. You know, gender is an artificial construct, race is an artificial construct. But community members oftentimes can sort of overlook this and move past this and find ways that people identify with each other, even if they are kind of artificial constructs, and develop community archives and use that artificial construct as a way to achieve political gains or gains in representation and things of that nature. The Caswell chapter also notes how, or maybe it's from the Zavala article, I can't remember off the top of my head, but oftentimes community archives are a combination of different identities. So it may be a community archive that is based around the sexual orientation of a particular racial group. So an archive related to Black lesbians or bisexual Black people, and then you might throw in a geographic location as well. So maybe uh, members of the Jewish community in Milwaukee. That might be a community archive. So oftentimes it's not just one of these sort of identifiers or community types that form a community archive, but typically it is some sort of combination. Sometimes, as I sort of touched on, these can be quite specific. Sometimes they can be quite broad. So if you look at the South Asian American Digital Archive, that can encompass people from any number of countries, some of which are very different from each other. So that's an example of a very broad sort of uh, community that is, yeah, just kind of focused around one very broad identity. So, you can kind of see every color of the rainbow, really. One interesting thing that the Caswell chapter also touches on is that communities and community archives may exclude as well as include. So, we like to see and think of community archives as being these sort of sources of equality and empowerment in society. But if you take a closer look at them, they can be exclusionary in a lot of ways. So if you feel like you are a member of the queer community, and so you go to a community archive expecting to sort of see yourself represented, but for whatever reason there aren't records related to transgender people and you identify as transgender, then that can be alienating and exclusionary as well. So there may be some disconnect between what community or communities a community archive seeks to represent or claims to represent and who is actually represented within a community archive. So that's just kind of an interesting differentiation to make. Another interesting thing that the Caswell chapter notes is that sometimes community archives may represent and serve dominant communities. So she talks about historical societies as an example of a community archive that can be formed to sort of reinforce the power of dominant communities in a particular location, to sort of glorify the history of a community that is already in power, within a particular geographic area. And she makes a differentiation between those types of community archives and community archives which are meant to fight against oppression and marginalization. So that kind of leads us to our next quote here: framed as ways for people and communities to gain control of decision-making surrounding issues of shared history, memory, narrative, preservation, and power. So we'll talk about why community archives exist in just a second, but a big part of the reason why community archives exist is to gain control over a community's, history and sense of heritage, and also to promote a sense of identity among community members. That's not something that we'll touch on too much in this lecture, but it's another reason why community archives exist as well. Okay, and then the Sheffield chapter for this week described them in part as political project to both legitimize the experiences of a group and a creative endeavor that reflects the group's values. So typically we don't think of as archives as being creative endeavors, just kind of just the facts, collections of records to be used for evidence and so on. But community archives can differ from this, sometimes in pretty meaningful ways. And we'll talk about this more later on when we discuss some of the challenges that community archives present to more traditional archives, but this can be one of the reasons why some people and probably outside of the archival profession as well, kind of question the value or sort of credibility of community archives. Because if something is seen as creative, then it's not necessarily an objective set of records that people can use, for evidence or kind of more, I guess, legalistic or official purposes. And some people might say, well, because of that, it's not really an archive, it's just more kind of like, a project. And that's something that the Sheffield article sort of touches on, that community archives may be referred to as community memory projects or something of that nature. And in some ways, the term archive isn't necessarily the most appropriate one. That's kind of a discussion for a more advanced class. But there is more of an element of sort of creativity and I guess freedom as far as what is contained in community archives than you might necessarily see in a more traditional archive. And again, that's something that we will talk about in just a little bit. So I think it's important to talk about the connection between community archives and personal archives now that we've kind of talked about what community archives are. Because I think personal archives have a potential to contain content and context that illustrates the complexity, history, evolution, the sort of specificity of a community over time. And this is something that the Caswell chapter talks about when it's discussing the videos from the Alan family, sort of documenting the experience of an individual coming to America and what Caswell describes as the violence of assimilation that this individual sort of goes through. But images like this can allow people to show communities in ways that are more accurate and more representative of what the community is and see who the members of the community are. And that's something that can be used to legitimize the experiences of a group or of a community to say, hey, look at what we've gone through. We have a history, and these personal archives can be strong pieces of evidence of a community's place within society, and again of the experiences that a community has faced over time. And if these personal archives are not valued by archivists, then there's a strong risk for this type of representation to be lost. And that's certainly an unfortunate thing. If the only sort of accurate and meaningful representations of the community exist in things like home movies or diaries or letters where people are documenting their experiences of coming to America and kind of going through time and assimilating or not assimilating as an American. If this sort of rich information is lost and the only perspective of a person's experience or of a community's experience exists in organizational records, which may be created by individuals who are not from the community and may have harmful understandings of what a community is, or maybe just inaccurate understandings of what a community is, then that can definitely shape how a society views a particular community. If they're only taking sort of the kind of the official narrative of what a community is and what community members are like. And again, if this personal archives perspective or evidence is lost, if it's not collected in archives, then that can be pretty harmful for the community. So personal archives can support a lot of the goals of community archives, which we'll touch on later. So next we'll talk a little bit about why community archives exist. In the Sheffield chapter, the author talks about them as ways for community members to maintain their own documentary heritage, that they stem from a desire to direct ownership and custody of that heritage or of community records. And that's pretty understandable, right? If your community has a history and that history has been represented through things like personal archives, through whatever types of records a community may use to communicate with other community members, communicate with people outside of the community, to document the community's history. It's certainly understandable that a community would want to maintain possession and control over those records, right? So that they can hopefully prevent some of the misrepresentations from occurring that I just talked about that may be present in more official organizational records. The Caswell chapter talks about community archives as a response to disempowerment by oppressive systems. So situations in which histories have been ignored, maligned, or misrepresented. And Caswell equates it to this term symbolic annihilation. So a situation in which a community's history has been either not been recorded and not been represented in archives, or if it has been represented in archives, the version of a community's history that is represented in archives is purposefully skewed in a particular way, or maybe even unintentionally skewed in a particular way that doesn't represent the actual experiences and histories of a community and of the members of that community. So in essence, the community has been symbolically annihilated. So it may exist as an entity. There may obviously still people in that community, but from a historical perspective, there isn't an accurate or meaningful representation of that community that exists in archives and is likely to be accessible to researchers and even community members in the future. And so community archives just sprung up as a response to this symbolic annihilation. And so it's interesting to think about some of the different archival processes that we've talked about that might contribute to this symbolic annihilation. Obviously, appraisal is a big one, right? As it always is. So when we talk about histories being ignored, appraisal is a key way that that can happen. If archives choose not to collect records related to a particular community, even if that community might be relevant to the archive's mission, then that can result in that the history of a community being ignored, right? So pretty clear connection there. When we talk about communities being maligned or misrepresented, a big one that I can think of is arrangement and description. So if when archives are describing a community in a finding aid, and purposefully or unintentionally they're using words that are inaccurate or maybe even harmful to describe the community, that can obviously result in a distorted picture of that community being presented to people both inside and outside of the community, and that can create an instance where symbolic annihilation can take place. Online access, obviously, could be another one. If archivists place records online that sort of skew a person's understanding or perception of a community, maybe only certain parts of the community are highlighted, and perhaps those portions that are highlighted in online collections are things that maybe reinforce stereotypes about a community or present the community in a negative light, again, intentionally or unintentionally, that can result in a community being maligned and misrepresented as well. So there's a strong influence that archives can have on the symbolic annihilation of communities taking place. And so community archives have sprung up as a way to kind of counter that power and to take the power away from archives to be arbiters in how communities are represented to other members of society, to the community members themselves, to potential researchers. And again, when we talk about disempowerment by oppressive systems, what is more disempowering than having the history of your community, skewed or misrepresented or ignored, right? So community archives are fundamentally about retaking that power and helping communities represent themselves as opposed to being represented by archives. The Caswell chapter goes on to talk about community archives as a response to white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, colonialism, capitalism, ableism, and their interactions. And the Caswell chapter essentially says that archives and Western archival theory support all of these. So she really kind of takes archives to task for operating in ways that have resulted in the disempowerment of communities. And she essentially says that throughout history, archives have been some of the oppressive systems that have resulted in the symbolic annihilation of archives. And again, as I just talked about, I think that there's a certain degree of truth to that argument. So again, just essentially saying that archives have contributed to a lot of the circumstances that have caused the necessity for community archives to exist. So again, intentionally or unintentionally, we, as archivists, have supported these sort of reinforcements of power, reinforcements of white people as the winners in society, as white males as the winners in society, as colonialism and capitalism as sort of the winning ideologies in society. And that has resulted in a situation in which community archives have to spring up in order to sort of right that wrong and correct the record. Again, I'm not necessarily sure that I 100% agree with all of what Caswell writes in this chapter. If it's true now, I would say it's much less true than it was maybe even 10 or 15 years ago, especially with the interest in social justice that a lot of archives have developed and acted on over the last, 10 or 15 years. So yeah, I'm not entirely sure that the conditions that exist for communities today that result in the need for the creation of community archives are as pressing as they might have been like a decade or a decade and a half ago. It's not to say that they don't exist and the archives don't contribute to oppressive systems and marginalization today, I would like to think that if they do, it's more unintentional than maybe it was in the past. Um, but I definitely think that things are better. Maybe I'm just an optimist. But I'm obviously not a member of a lot of the communities that sort of operate within these oppressive systems, so I'm probably not the best person to make that judgment, in all honesty. And that's something interesting that the Caswell chapter talks about. She sort of wrestles with her role as a white woman, being a part of the leadership of this South Asian American digital archive, right? And essentially, or eventually, she sort of steps aside and says, "I'm really not the best person to be a leader in this." So obviously, when I say that archives are contributing to these kind of things less than they were in the past, I'm speaking from a perspective of, um, I guess, a perspective of power, right? And, people who are kind of faced with discrimination and marginalization every day may very well have a different perspective than I do, and probably a more informed perspective. I'm the dreaded web cham that the casual article talks about, right? So, the white ethnically European, bourgeois, Christian, cis, citizen, heterosexual, able-bodied male, I'm like all of those except for two. So, I guess that's enough to maybe make my perspective different from people who face oppression more than I do in those communities. But again, I'm just trying to be optimistic here and say that things have gotten better, and hopefully they continue to get better by students like you learning more about social justice and community archives in your archives courses. So we can definitely make some connections between why community archives exist and some of our discussions relate to social justice last week. So here are the things that social justice strives for and strives against from the Duff chapter from last week. So if community archives are responses to disempowerment by systems of oppression, and that they are responses to symbolic annihilation that has occurred in society and in archives, you can make some pretty strong connections between why community archives exist and a desire for full human recognition and a disruption of structures of non-recognition. So if you can argue that archives are systems of non-recognition, that they are systems of marginalization, then community archives exist to counter that, right? To strive towards fuller human recognition by presenting perspectives of communities and of community members that originate from the community itself and not the disinterested and disconnected archivist. When you look at the fair and just redistribution of power, again, if you are fighting against disempowerment in society by creating community archives, then that is related to redistributing power. Full and equal participation, we talked about how participation is a huge aspect of community archives. So if we see community archives as a venue through which community members and community archives can participate in the representation of a community, then we can connect that to full and equal participation and the acknowledgement and remedy of historical inequalities. So, obviously community archives exist because these historical inequalities have taken place and people are taking specific measures to remedy them. So some pretty strong connections between community archives and social justice. And to elaborate on that a little bit further, last week we talked about how can archives contribute to social justice by working with donors, by establishing value and trust, by supporting effective access, by inviting participation, you know, these are all things that community archives can do to support social justice, right? So work with donors in the community to make sure that community archives represent every aspect of the community instead of not just a few, to get people to trust and value the community archives so that it's supported. The Zavala article talked about sustainability and how that can be difficult. To provide effective access to the memories and experiences of the community and of individuals within the community, so that people can use these experiences to feel more empowered, to enact change in society through activism, and again to invite participation, to empower the whole community to participate in the community archive and to create a community archive that again represents every aspect of the community in a deep and meaningful way, and not just a few parts of the community. And you could argue that mainstream and traditional archives have a role in this too. So, uh, there are different types of partnerships that can exist between mainstream archives and community archives. Situations where a mainstream archive can provide advice to community archives and how they might tackle record keeping decisions. Um, Partnerships where mainstream archives might do some outreach for community archives or help them set up an exhibit that they can share with the public. So there are a variety of different relationships that can occur in which mainstream archives can help community archives uh, support their social justice efforts. Now, sort of the trick here is that these relationships and partnerships have to be genuine and mutually beneficial. It can't be a situation where mainstream archives are uh, entering in these partnerships and taking advantage of community archives, maybe for like the purposes of looking hip, or uh, because they're kind of planning on absorbing community archives eventually anyway, so they're kind of like preparing them to be ingested, I guess. But if these types of mutually beneficial, kind of non-colonial partnerships and relationships can exist, then there can be a lot of ways that mainstream archives can support community archives in some of the social justice efforts that we just talked about. Okay, so next we'll look at some of the essential aspects of community archives. The Caswell chapter talks about community autonomy over care of records. So again, it's the community that's making record keeping decisions surrounding records, and uh, it's not a situation where community records are being collected by an extractive mainstream archives, in which the community might have little or no say over record keeping decisions surrounding the community's records. The Sheffield article talks about community archives as being institutions that collect records, but also legitimize communities and reflect their values. So that's sort of an essential part too. Working towards saying the community exists, share the values of the community, and presenting those to the public. The Sheffield article also talks about taking the heritage out of the heritage industry and back into the community context. So again, this idea of uh, taking the power over the content and context of community records and placing them in the hands of community members and having them participate in determining exactly what the heritage of a community looks like and how it should be portrayed to the public. So sort of circling all these things I've talked about is this idea of participation and active participation, which is something that we talked about when we discussed what community archives are. So if you talk about community autonomy over care of records, that means the community is participating in record keeping decisions. If you talk about community archives legitimizing communities and reflecting their values, that implies that community members are going to be the ones who are determining what those values are and how they should be communicated to the public through community archives. If you talk about uh, putting a community's heritage into the community context, it's community members that are participating in deciding what that community context looks like instead of people like mainstream archivists who may not be part of the community or have any connection with the community at all. So participation is definitely central to the essence or essential part of community archives. And if that participation doesn't take place, or if it takes place in a superficial manner, then that reduces the ability of a community archives to really say, we are from the community, we represent the community, and the community has had a role in saying what the community archive looks like and how the community archive operates. And community participation, or the participation by people represented in community records, is one of the main ways that community archives challenge traditional archival practices. So as we've talked about in this course, typically it is one or two archivists within an archive who are appraising records and arranging and describing records and making a lot of the key decisions surrounding a set of records that can result in things like symbolic annihilation. And again, with community archives, the idea is that these decisions are decentralized and it's multiple people within the community that are helping decide which records are important to the community and belong in the community archive, or which are the best terms to describe individuals or events within a community's history. So this idea of focusing on participation by community members, by those represented in archives, is definitely a pretty strong departure from how archives have operated in the past and continue to operate today. It's important to note that community archives may challenge archival practices to varying degrees. So there may be some community archives which operate in a lot of the ways that more traditional archives operate, and there may be community archives that have record-keeping practices that depart from mainstream archives in pretty meaningful ways. So there's not like a community archives monolith out there. There are, again, sort of every color of the rainbow, depending on things like just community interest in community archives, community involvement, the amount of participation, the resources that a community archive has. All these things are going to differ the degree to which they're able to encourage and reflect community participation. And some community archives are able to do this well because they have the resources to be able to do it, and some community archives are not, so they're are maybe more likely to sort of follow the beaten path that more traditional archives have already kind of laid out, and community archives may end up, again, operating in a way which is quite similar to their more traditional or mainstream brethren. One of the ways in which community archives may differ from traditional archives, so we already talked about participation, is through the idea of post-custodialism. So this idea that rather than taking custody of records, archives may just scan the records and return them to the individuals that provided them. This is something that is mentioned in the Zavala article on pages 6 and 7. And they talk about some of the benefits of doing that. So that's certainly a departure from how archives typically operate. You know, with a more mainstream archives, unless the records are kind of signed over to the archive, there's a lot of reluctance to do anything to take care of those records because, you know, if the archive doesn't own it, then a lot of archives don't see a lot of incentive to kind of take care of records that aren't actually theirs. The Zavala article also touches on including community members in discussions over how the archive operates. So again, this idea of participation. And again, it's important to note that the breadth and depth of participation may vary. And maybe a situation in which only a few members of the community are participating in a meaningful way. And if those individuals might represent only a small portion of the population that a community archive seeks to represent or says it represents, then that can create a situation in which community archive prevents kind of a skewed view of a community. So, for example, if community archive says we're an archive for the LGBTQ population or community, but most of the people who are making decisions within that community archive are, you know, gay males, then that may kind of skew the community archive and what the community archive represents to fit, you know, the perspective of gay males because they're the ones that are making these decisions, right? So again, it just kind of speaks to the importance of participation and why it's an essential part of community archives. You know, you can say that community archives are these kind of revolutionary forces and that they are going to differ from mainstream archives in meaningful ways. But again, unless you have a lot of participation that represents the whole community, that might not be the case, and you might result in an archive that you know, kind of closely resembles traditional archives in a lot of ways and doesn't present as much of a challenge to traditional archival practices. The Sheffield article talks about how community archives bring together materials related to the community in sort of an artificial way, and there's not as much of a priority on things like authenticity and reliability, which we've talked about in this course as being desirable aspects of records that come into archival care and custody. And the Sheffield article also talks about records being collected by community archivists in a variety of formats, including those not considered archival. So things that are maybe more ephemeral that may be important to communities and to community members, but for whatever reason haven't really been considered by mainstream archives as being quote unquote archival throughout the years. And that's definitely one of the ways that archives can be considered oppressive bodies or parts of an oppressive system. You know, if you as an archive say, well, we don't think that this is an archival record or quote unquote archival form of communication, but it's actually a way in which community members in the past and maybe in the present have communicated with each other, then you're sort of saying this form of communication isn't valid and, you know, we don't feel like it belongs in an archive. And you're saying you're kind of marginalizing a form of communication which might actually be important for a particular community. And that can result in a lot of information being lost simply because archives are saying, well, we don't think that this is archival for whatever reason, or it kind of fits outside of our concept of what a record should be. And Sheffield states that within community archives, there's more of a willingness to kind of expand the notion of what a record is and what a record isn't, and include multiple formats of records in community archives, which may not be welcome or present in their more traditional mainstream brethren. The casual article talks about how community archives tend to be more activist in orientation. So a strong rejection of the neutrality and objectivity that we have talked about in this course is something that archives like to kind of maintain and say that they are a part of, even though it's not true. Caswell talks about how community archives consider the emotional component of records and record keeping, which isn't something that archives typically consider. So again, with more mainstream archives, it's just, oftentimes it's more focused on creating evidence, and the focus on sort of memory keeping and emotion and responses to records isn't considered as much, or isn't documented as much as efforts to kind of strive towards being a resource for researchers that kind of divorces the records from any emotional component that they might have. Caswell describes community archives as valuing people over stuff. Again, that's probably true to traditional archives to a certain extent. And just in general, by challenging archival practices that support white supremacy. So things like what is and isn't a record. So I talked about how that could reinforce valuing one community over another. So again, kind of going back to this notion of archives as vehicles for white supremacy and capitalism and colonialism and ableism and all those bad things. And again, community archives is serving as a counter to that by challenging the notions that archives have accepted and cultivated over the years, which support the actions by archives which have supported white supremacy over the years. And in this class, we talked about a lot of value judgments that archives make about records, right? So this record is archival and this record isn't. This collection belongs in an archive. This collection doesn't. This collection should be processed at a more thorough level. These collections shouldn't. This collection should be preserved very carefully because it has intrinsic value. These collections do not, and they should get kind of minimal preservation care. These records are worthy of being placed online, and these records aren't. And so it's interesting to consider how these decisions that archives have made over time, and the fact that there may be only a few individuals contributing to the decision-making processes that surround these value judgments, can support white supremacy, because maybe the people that are making these decisions are white, and maybe consciously or subconsciously they make value judgments that support sort of their identity and their background and their perspective about what's important in society and in history. And especially through the focus on participation and broadening participation, community archives, at least ideally, operate in a way which dilutes a lot of this sort of homogenization of who is and isn't making decision processes surrounding record keeping decisions and value judgments that an archive makes. And by doing so, challenging a lot of archival tradition and archival practice. And again, by engaging in practices that challenge archival traditions and archival notions, which may or may not support white supremacy, we can see how community archives, again, are striving for more human recognition and some of the other things that social justice is related to. So, by challenging the decisions and practices that have led to archives becoming structures of non-recognition and structures of disrespect and marginalization, community archives are striving towards fuller human recognition and seeking to redistribute power, have more equal participation, and acknowledging that the things in the past have resulted in inequalities in society. So I'll wrap things up by looking at our types of creation in archives. Obviously, community archives are strongly associated with creation by communities to which creators belong. Again, this idea that the community is having a strong say in record-keeping decisions surrounding the records in a community archive. And so by doing that, they are having a strong creative role in what collections within community archives look like and what the community archive itself looks like. That's not to say that there isn't going to be some influence by the archivists themselves within community archives. So it may be just a couple of archivists within a community archive that are maybe structuring what participation looks like and structuring the discussion surrounding some of these record-keeping decisions. That's kind of inevitable that someone is going to lead the charge and shape these processes somewhat. But again, ideally, there is less of this and more of this within the community archives practice. Okay, so we'll go ahead and wrap up things there. If you are interested in learning more about community archives, we do have a community archives course here at UWM within SOAS that I teach. So you can definitely spend a whole semester learning about community archives. But we've definitely scratched the surface here. And I hope that you realize that community archives are a response to a lot of the things that have gone on in the archival profession over the last, centuries, maybe even millennia. They're certainly not a perfect response for some of the reasons that I talked about, maybe due to a lack of participation and things that created the conditions that community archives are meant to fight against. But if they're done well, they can definitely serve as tools for social justice. And I think it's important for mainstream archivists to think about how they can support community archives in their efforts to support social justice in a way that is mutually beneficial. And again, that's something that we talk about in my community archives course to a fair extent. So, okay, as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for your efforts this semester, since this is our last lecture of the semester. I hope that you've learned a lot this week and in this course. As always, please let me know if you have any questions about anything, and take care.